Very good conversation based on what I have seen so far and what I've read from the book by today's guest. And let me say one thing real quick. I know some people are wondering, yes, we're praying for the President and the First Lady. Hopefully, regardless of your political position, your faith is bigger than your politics, and we're all praying together. No, I don't have any sort of inside information. I haven't talked to my dad this morning. I don't know if he's talked to anybody up there. Probably has, but we will continue to watch that. It's been a crazy year, and it's just getting crazier. All right, so today's guest has a book out called The Deeply Formed Life, and I think it's very timely because I was on my Twitter feed, unfortunately, and seeing what a lot of people are made of when the news of the President and the First Lady's diagnosis was made public early this morning. And I think intense situations, intense times will show you what you're made of. My dad likes to say that you don't know if a grape is sweet or sour until you squeeze it and the juice comes out. So when life squeezes you, you find out what you're made of. And we really have to go for some depth, and that's what we're going to talk about today with today's guest, Pastor Rich Villodas from Elmhurst, Queens, if you know the New York City area. He's lead pastor of New Life Fellowship. And his book, well, I'll just set it up with this. It's a great little piece to set up the topic, and then we will roll into this and have a good discussion with Pastor Rich. Watch this.
The world is changing. We are at a moment in history where we are confronted with a level of change that is disorienting. This kind of rapid change exposes the shallow root system that's beneath us. How do we live from a different center, from a deeper center? When I look at the world and the church at large, I recognize that we are regularly being formed by a shallow root system that's insufficient to sustain a life that's faithful to Jesus. Whether we know it or not, see it or not, understand it or not, we are often negatively formed by our families of origin, by cultural forces, and by a worldly value system that's marked by individualism, consumerism, and division. In short, we are often discipled into superficiality. But there's another way. I believe Christ can form us through a deeply rooted value system. I wrote The Deeply Formed Life because I believe we need a new framework, a new paradigm that holds together values that are typically segmented. And these held together values can hold us together, whether individualistically or collectively. The values I write about don't just come from my head, but from a flesh and blood community in Queens, New York City, an international, multiracial urban community. And these values have deeply formed thousands of people around the world and have deeply formed my life. In this book, I explore 5 values that must be held together. Values of contemplative rhythms, of racial justice, of interior examination, of sexual wholeness, of missional presence. And I believe that these 5 values, when held together, can bring about the kind of change we are desperately longing for.
That is The Deeply Formed Life, and I have Pastor Rich with me right now. Welcome to Life Today Live.
Thanks for having me. So good to be here.
Oh, it's good to have you. So let's jump into this. And I mean, we heard a good overview in the book trailer there, but give me a little more about what this deeply formed life means to you and to each of us.
Yeah, as I think of it as a pastor, the deeply formed life is about a life that is shaped by Jesus and for the world, of course. And that's an easy Sunday school answer to that kind of a question. But when I think about the implications of what that means in the current world that we're in, the deeply formed life is about being widely shaped by uh, various values that speak to the cultural moment that we're in. And so, for me, as the video showed, it's a contemplative life for a crazy, exhausted existence, racial justice and reconciliation for a divided world, interior examination for a world living on the surface, sexuality, sexual wholeness for a world that splits souls from bodies, and missional presence for a disengaged and consumeristic society. These are areas that flow out of the life of our congregation, these values. And so I wrote really primarily as a pastor for our congregation and really for the wider world as well.
All right, we're going to walk through those 5 points because uh, some people don't know what they mean, and some of those things mean different things to different people. So I definitely want to unpack
Yeah.
those. But I want to start with the three things that you sort of pick on, if you will. And I think we get them. Consumerism, I think we all get that. Yeah, that's a negative. I think every Christian will say, yeah, that's a negative thing. Division, a little more complex at times. We're supposed to come out of the world, so there is a natural division that takes place. But yet, how does that apply when we turn around and reach the world? For God so loved the world. So there's a little bit of a paradox there at times. And then individualism. I think this is the one, especially in America. You know this. That's almost an American value of individualism, and I think there's a balance there as well. So let's hit some of those. Let's start with the individualism. What exactly are you saying in that regard? Because I do think this is important, because I think one of the downfalls of the American individualism, which has a healthy side to it, is that we also, in the church, tend to forget community. What are you saying?
Yeah, for me, yeah, we are individuals, and the challenge I draw from family systems theory a lot. And in family systems theory, there's a wonderful phrase called differentiation. And differentiation at its core is about holding on to myself or remaining close to myself while remaining close to others in times of high anxiety.
Hmm.
And it is resisting the polar opposite pole of cutting people off or being unhealthily enmeshed with others. And so the call to the individualistic value that's often dominated within our country is one that I think comes from a good place, but is often done at the expense of neighbor love, asserting my own rights and such. And so that's the tension that we have to hold on to. What does it mean that I do have uh, I am an individual and called to this kind of freedom of speech, whatever it might be. At the same time, I'm part of a larger collection of human beings, and my primary call as a follower of Jesus is to love my neighbor as myself. And so it is this tension that we have to hold on to. And sadly, many of us have a hard time holding on to that tension in a healthy way.
Yeah, definitely. And strictly speaking in scriptural terms, salvation is very much an individual thing, and yet when you look at the way God's used community throughout history, God tends to work through other people more than directly doing things. He's got this fascination with his creation, I guess. From just within the church standpoint, what do you how do we balance a proper accountability as an individual with the community that God is very specific about the church being a critical part of
Yeah.
our lives spiritually?
I think, and this is going to come across as cliche, but I think the question is, what is the loving thing to do? And that does require reflection, prayer, discernment, conversation with friends, loved ones, etc. But I think the question is, if we're going to follow Christ in this world, the question of discerning our individualistic decisions and in the larger collective reality that we find ourselves in is, what is the loving thing to do? And we might disagree with that, but I think that's the question that should be leading the way. And so, whether it's masks, should I wear masks or not? Whether it is something else that's polarizing, I think the question that we need to at least begin from, and we might end up with different conclusions, but is, how is this shaping us to love God and love our neighbor as ourselves? And I think if we can begin there, we can have healthier conversations around this reality of just individualism as it pertains to us in the larger society.
Yeah, it's funny to mention the masks. I've got a friend up in Idaho, and he's like, we shouldn't be wearing masks. I'm like, you live in Idaho. You live in New York City. In New York City, I would be masking up every day, every time I left.
It's 2.2 million people in Queens where I live.
Yeah, that's okay. So when you look at that, and that brings us to the other point I wanted to discuss up top is the division. And yeah, I mean, it's funny because we lose the sense of history, But if you look back in the '60s, man, there was division in this country that was, I think, still even worse than today, arguably, but it seems to be very close. As Christians who are to be united, but we don't always agree, especially when it comes to the hot topic of like politics, not to mention the theological differences we have, how do we maintain a godly unity in such a divided world?
Yeah, it's a great question. And as a pastor, listen, I have 75 nations represented in the church that I pastor. And we have within our congregation Black Lives Matter activists and All Lives Matter congregants. We have pro-Trump and never Trump often sitting next to each other, unbeknownst to each other. They knew they probably would step away to the next row. And so this is something, as a pastor, I am wrestling with weekly. As I see people in their exchanges on social media, as I get emails, I think a couple of things as it pertains to division and unity. And one is that recognizing that unity does not necessarily mean uniformity, that we don't have to be thinking on the same lines to have unity of spirit and unity of heart. And it's often the case that people want everyone to believe as I do and see everything the way I see it. And that is the means by which unity is going to be found. And good luck with that. So that's the first thing. Unity doesn't necessarily mean uniformity, and it often doesn't mean it. But unity is often secured by humble listening and a willingness to open myself up to someone else. At our church, we talk about incarnational listening. And it's a skill that we teach, which comes out of the life of Jesus, the incarnation, where Jesus leaves his world. He enters into the world of someone else, and he allows himself to be shaped by that new reality that he's in. I think in a very similar way, the incarnation is not just good theology that teaches us about God. It teaches us about how to relate to one another well. What does it mean to leave my world and enter into the world of someone else? Now, that takes humility. That takes a willingness to listen and recognize that listening doesn't necessarily mean agreeing, but I do want to be able to step into the shoes of someone else to say, tell me your story, tell me your values, tell me your fears, and not just be ready to respond, but actually to discern those reactions or responses and the work for unity. And so those are a few of the things that I am regularly trying to teach and embody in a large congregation that's incredibly diverse. And some days there are good days, and some days there's bad days. But I think that's one of the ways that we can work towards unity.
Yeah, I can't imagine, frankly. You have a tough task. And it's interesting, though. I like that because Jesus never compromised the truth. He was always truth, even when he did what you're talking about, even when he listened, even when he empathized with us imperfect humans. And what that balance, that's good. So how do we get there? Well, you've got your 5 key pathways that you outline in the book, and I'll show people the book right here. It's called The Deeply Formed Life, Pastor Rich Villodas. And I read through these 5, and I thought, okay, what does that mean? Let's roll through these real quick. And the first one is you touched on it, the contemplative rhythms.
Yeah.
What are you talking about in that?
When I think about contemplative rhythms, I think first of all about slowing our lives down to be with God, to love God well, love our neighbor well, love ourselves well. And so I live in the city that never sleeps. I live in a city that is incredibly active, fast paced, and so, but I can attest that we can slow down. And by slowing down, I'm talking about things like uh, embracing Sabbath keeping, a rhythm where 1 out of 7 days we stop our work, paid work and unpaid work, to be with God, to enjoy creation, to delight in our family in ways that are restorative. I think about slowing down in prayer, in the slow reading of Scripture. There's some folks right now who are probably watching this that are maybe watching on their phone or what have you, and they're probably scrolling. We live in a scrolling, skimming, superficial world. What does it mean to slow down our lives to be with God in Holy Scripture? And so when I think about contemplative rhythms, I'm thinking first of all about slowing our lives down to be with God.
I like that a lot. We definitely can do more of that. The idea of be still and know that I am God. I think a lot of times we lose sight when we're just rushing through life. The interior examination, I think, goes along with that, and I think this is something most people are familiar with. What is it about interior examination that strikes you?
It's often the case that I've seen as a pastor and I've seen within myself that I can use God to run from God or use God to run from myself. And I believe that Jesus wants to transform every aspect of our lives, our external life and our interior life. And yet, being able to look within is often very challenging for people because to look within means I have to wrestle with some of the difficult emotions that often reside within me, the anxiety, the fear, the rage, the sadness, the grief. It's very easy to want to ignore those things, but sooner or later, those things catch up to us. It's very easy to miss out on the ways that our families of origin, our parents, our grandparents, for all the good that they've tried to do in us. We have gaps. We say at our church that Jesus lives in your heart, but grandpa lives in your bones. And what we mean by that is we all have positive legacies from our families, and we also have negative legacies that have been handed down from one generation to the next. And the ways that we begin to walk in wholeness in the way of Jesus is by identifying those ways. And it requires us to look within to see the ways that we've been formed and shaped. And so that's some of the things that comes to mind when I talk about interior examination.
Yeah, that's good. That's good. Your third point, your third pathway to a deeper, more deeply formed life, I should say, is one that is probably not real popular, especially where you're at, and that's the idea of sexual wholeness. What are you talking about there?
Yeah, that's one that gets me in trouble from time to time, and as a pastor. But this is what I mean by sexual wholeness. First of all, that our spirituality and our sexuality are to be integrated. And it's often the case that we fall into different ways of relating to our sexuality as it pertains to our spirituality. There's an author named Christopher West. He talked about 3 diets that we often fall into. And he said the church's diet as it pertains to spirituality and sexuality is the starvation diet. And that is the church is often known by repression, starvation, suppression. We have no room for our desires. And so what ends up happening is if you suppress so much, you're going to act out in one way or another, which we see all the time happening within church circles. And so the starvation diet is not enough. The world, however, has this fast food diet. And so if the starvation diet is marked by repression, the fast food diet is marked by reduction. And by reduction, I mean your desires, particularly sexual desires, become the most important things that need to be satisfied. And so do whatever you can to have those needs satisfied. But like fast food, too much fast food is going to get you sick. And so what is really the third way of being? And it's the banquet, it's the feast. And that feast is a recognition, first of all, that our bodies and our sexuality points to something other than ourselves. It points to our longings for God. This is what C.S. Lewis talked about when he said that if we find in this world desires that cannot be fulfilled, it means that we were probably meant for another world. And we were meant to live in the love of God, and our bodies and our sexuality points to that. How do we integrate that now? How do we have a healthy relationship with our own bodies, recognize the ways that we've been formed sexually by our culture, by our families of origin? This is the work of the deeply formed life. But ultimately, it's the integration of our spirituality with our sexuality. That's what I'm trying to get at.
So, in a world that doesn't like marriage and doesn't like a biblical model of marriage, it's easy. I think the natural thing for Christians to do is strictly condemn everyone else's sex life.
Yeah.
How do we best communicate the biblical truth in a world that's just rejecting the nuclear family, the monogamy, even marriage in some cases? Especially, I mean, you're in an area where you're having to face this. That's why I think it's interesting.
Yeah. I think like our individual lives, with marriage in particular, the greatest witness that the church has with regard to marriage are marriages that actually look like the love of God.
Mm-hmm.
And so we can march out and say this is what marriage is to be, and at the same time our marriages are often bereft of any kind of life, joy, and love. Dr. Robert Mulholland, he's a professor, late professor from Asbury Seminary, and he said there's two ways of being in the world. We can be in the world for God, or we can be in God for the world. Very big difference. To be in the world for God, you don't really need God. You can just take your banner of whatever issue you want and raise it high and say God is concerned about this. And God may be concerned about it. It's often the case that we think God is most concerned about what we're most concerned about. But the other way of being is I'm in God for the sake of the world. And I think this applies to marriages. That if our marriages, I mean, the church often has no leg to stand on morally because our marriages are just as bad as the world's marriages. And so what if we took the call to love our spouse as our primary neighbor well, and to show our marriage as a sign and wonder of the love of God? I think that's where we need to be starting, first of all, before we begin to create boundaries about who's in, who's out, what's right, what's wrong. Let it come from our own lives first, out of which we then seek to talk about the larger public and social realities.
Yeah, you're right. And that goes right back to your point of interior examination, right? So I like how these are all tied together. Here's the one, though, that is big right now, and will get you in trouble probably the fastest, and has a term. When we talk about racial reconciliation, I think we all go, yeah, great. But then you throw in the term social justice, and that means so many things to so many different people that it you got to be careful using the phrase, right?
Yeah.
What are you seeing? What are you looking for?
When I first of all think about justice, it's a good biblical word, as is reconciliation. And by justice, I'm first talking about God making right what's wrong in our society. And so to talk about matters of justice and race, I think we have to talk about it on three levels: on an individual level, on an interpersonal level, and on an institutional level. To talk about justice, as a Christian, we are in the tradition of the Old Testament prophets who cared about the poor, who cared about the widow, who cared about the orphan. These are social matters that pertain to the life of the church and the life of those who call upon the name of God. And so it's very easy to categorize justice in particular areas here. I think we need to look to the scriptures and see a God who's very much concerned with the material needs of people and the social needs of people, and not to create unnecessary hierarchies of what's more important than the other. The fact that God comes in human flesh in Jesus and resurrects with a glorified body is really an indication that God cares about the material world. And God is not, he didn't come as a ghost, and he didn't resurrect as a ghost. He resurrected with a new humanity. And I think we look to Jesus, and Jesus is in the tradition of these Old Testament prophets. And so these matters of justice and reconciliation, I think, should matter to the church. And so ultimately, as one person said, justice is what love looks like in public. And it's a matter of right relationships and right verdicts, and the structuring of the world in a way that leads to the wholeness, love, joy, peace, etc. And so that's what I mean when I talk about justice in the world, and relationships, verdicts, all of those things.
It's tough, I find, to talk about justice in a large sense, a societal sense, when we base our justice on biblical principles which are rejected by the society. Are we ever going to really get to the right kind of justice in a society that rejects God?
This is truly the enigma before us, because in a pluralistic society where there are many who don't subscribe to a biblical worldview of how the world should be ordered, it makes these conversations incredibly difficult. Which I think the question for the Christian should be, okay, we disagree on so many different things here, but where can we begin to find common ground to work for the common good? It's often the case that we want everyone back to the uniformity. We want everyone to believe as we do before we're going to make any progress, whatever it might be, socially, etc. But I think the question is, for the Christian, how do we humbly say, we want to work for the common good. We want to see people moving in the right direction socially, spiritually, etc. But how can I, in a pluralistic society, begin to identify with others to say, where are the points of commonality where we can begin? And we might not get too far in the process, but where can we begin to see the world ordered towards fairness, justice, equity, etc.? I think that's a really good place to start. And it's a very difficult place to start because, I mean, I do want people, if I could be honest, made in my image. That's what I do want. I think we all want that to some degree or another. And I think we have to be honest with that first and go, maybe I'm not the right image that people should be made into. But at the same time, how can I humbly begin to partner with others who even might disagree with me on some significant things?
Yeah, that's good. I can always tell you guys, when I say you guys, you pastors that are in areas that are a lot, that can be very difficult to minister in, because you guys are forced to really think through these things. So I appreciate the depth and the reflection with which you even approach this. Because down here in the Bible Belt, it's like it's easy, and so we're not forced to deal with some of these. These are deep issues. So thank you for that. Excuse me. The fifth item on your pathway to more meaningful, a deeper faith, is this idea of missional presence, and I think this is key. And I like coming to this here at the end, because I think this will get us wherever we land on some of these other more sometimes difficult issues. If we can focus on this one, this will really set us right. So tell us what you mean by missional presence.
In short, what I mean by it is not just doing good things. What I mean by it is being the very presence of Jesus for a hurting world. That's what I mean by it. And so by missional presence, we can very easily focus on, what are the things I need to do? What are the houses I need to build? Who are the people I need to feed? These are all incredibly important things. But here's the thing, back to that in God for the world versus in the world for God. The first task is to now be the presence of Jesus for the world, so that when people see my life, they see the tenderness of God, the compassion of God, the holiness of God, the justice of God. And so for me to be missional, whether this is in your workplace, whether this is in your home, whether this is at the food pantry, in your local church, we want to be carrying, yes, this presence of Jesus. And I think that's what a Christian is someone who carries the presence of Jesus to a hurting, broken world, offering hope and healing. And that's manifested in the way we do our work. in the way we serve those who are on the margins of society, those who we disagree with, those who are not in relationship with Jesus as we preach the gospel. And so it's all those things when I think about missional presence, but at the core of it is being Christ for another.
That is so huge, and here's what I see is on these other issues where we may have some disagreements, or we may stumble, we may say things the wrong way. If we keep that missional presence in mind, and we are not just proclaiming the love of Jesus to the world, but we are demonstrating the love of Jesus to the world, I think that's where that love covers a multitude of sin, and I don't mean sin in some highly reprobate way in that context. I mean just missing the mark. So if I say something wrong, or if I offend you, or I don't vote the same as you, if I'm really focused on that mission of being Christ to the world, that love will cover any of the little mistakes, or, where I miss something, or I don't do something quite right. And so that is so huge. Thank you for saying that. I'm going to give you the last word, but I'm going to show people your book one more time. Here it is. It's called The Deeply Formed Life. And I love it because it's got roots. One of the things I like to say on this show is deeper roots mean better fruits, or better roots, better fruits. So yeah, I like the picture. And you got New York City on top of it. Pastor Rich Villodas, and you can go to the website there. It's richvillodas.com. You can see how it's spelled right up there in the top left. But Pastor Rich, I really appreciate your time. I appreciate your message, and I appreciate your thoughtfulness. Anything you want to leave us with before we're gone for the weekend?
Yeah, what I'd say is what I'm trying to do with this book is to reimagine spiritual formation and to provide a larger frame for it. It's often the case when we think about discipleship and spiritual formation, it's often individualistic, about my life with God in prayer and spiritual disciplines and such, like silence, solitude, Bible reading. I talk about those things in my book. But I'm providing a larger frame. And so that how do we think formationally about matters like race, sexuality, justice, prayer, our inner lives? And at the end of the day, Jesus Christ wants to transform every aspect of our lives and every aspect of society. And so hopefully this book is providing a larger frame for people to think formationally, Christianly, and think in the way of the gospel. So
Amen.
thanks for having me on.
Yeah, oh no, that's wonderful. Thank you for sharing. Thank you for just taking the time to reach out. And I know it's hard work just putting a book together, but one with this sort of depth. Appreciate the work, and I think you'll see it pay off. Thank you guys for watching, for hanging out, for sharing this interview, and hopefully you can spend the weekend maybe contemplating some of the things that Pastor Rich has brought to you, and go for that depth. We really need it, both for ourselves and for this world. That's it for today. We'll see you again next week on Life Today Live.